Thank you, everyone, for coming. Good afternoon. Welcome to our lecture series on Gaza, co-sponsored by our sister campus in Doha, Qatar, our African Studies program, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, and the Al Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. My name is Nader Hashemi. I teach religion and politics here at Georgetown. In response to events of October the 7th and the subsequent war in Gaza, we've organized a lecture series at Georgetown to examine this topic. This lecture series is just part and parcel of a larger programming agenda that we have for this semester that will focus on the Israel-Palestine conflict, the war in Gaza, etc. You can find out more information about that by going to our website. The reason for our focus on this topic should be self-evident to everyone who's here today and who's watching online. This is clearly a moment of deep crisis for Israelis, for Palestinians, for the broader Middle East, for US foreign policy, and indeed for our entire world. Because we're located in a School of International Studies, this demands that we engage with topics, with controversies and questions that are relevant for our world and that matter for our faculty and our students. The timing of today's event could not be more perfect. As many of you know, today at the International Court of Justice, they are examining an application brought forward by South Africa on the question of genocide and Israel's behavior and its conduct in Gaza. Of course, we didn't plan to have today's event coincide with that event at the International Court of Justice, but sometimes when you organize an event, you have unanticipated sort of a convergence of your programming with world events that helps with the promotion and our marketing strategy. And I suspect that the interest in this topic today is a reflection of events that are happening at the International Court of Justice. This is a lecture series, so you're going to have a lecture for 35 minutes, followed by a discussant who will offer comments of up to 10 minutes, and then there'll be a Q&A session. I realize this is somewhat of a controversial topic, so when it gets to the Q&A session, I'm going to ask for people who have dissenting points of view to go first, and then we'll take the non-dissenters afterwards. I have to say personally, it's a huge honor to have with us today Professor Raz Segal speaking on the question of genocide and Gaza. Last night we had an event at Busboys and Poets where he spoke for roughly 90 minutes and entertained questions. It was an incredibly intellectually stimulating and thought-provoking event. For those people who do not know, Raz Segal, Dr. Segal is an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, an endowed professor in the study of modern genocide at Stockton University. Dr. Segal has held various prestigious fellowships, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Fulbright Fellowship, and more recently he was a senior fellow at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies. His book publications have focused on the question of the history of genocide in Central and Eastern Europe. Dr. Segal is also working on two new books, one that provides a critical account of the history and memory of Holocaust bystanders, and a second book that's more relevant to today's topic, a book that analyzes Israeli mass violence from the 1948 Nakba up until the current war in Gaza. Dr. Segal is also a public intellectual. He writes for and has written for The Guardian, LA Times, The Nation, Jewish Currents, Haaretz, Plus 972 magazine. He's been on Democracy Now! On ABC News. Now, of course, why Raz Segal? After October the 7th and after the question of genocide has been raised, Dr. Segal has been the most forceful advocate among genocide scholars, arguing today that what we're seeing in Gaza is a violation by Israel of the 1948 Genocide Convention. And so we thought it would be apt to bring him here today. Yes, it's a controversial thesis, but the last time I checked, a university education is supposed to be about controversy, not conformity, which is one reason why we've begun this lecture series with this topic. We're also very pleased to have with us today our discussant, Shannon Fyfe. She's an assistant professor of philosophy and a fellow in the Institute of Philosophy and Public Policy at George Mason University. Dr. Fyfe's research interests are in political philosophy, ethics, and legal philosophy, with a focus on philosophy of international conflict, particularly international criminal law. She has a wealth of experience dealing with questions of human rights and international law in Syria, Tanzania, and Rwanda. We look forward to hearing from her during this event. And so it is a huge honor and pleasure to turn the floor over to our keynote speaker today. Please join me in welcoming to Georgetown University, Professor Raz Segal.
Right. Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Thank you, Nader, and thank you also, Shannon, for agreeing to join, and for all the co-sponsors and co-organizers. And thank you for coming here today, and for those who are joining online.
Can you just speak up a little bit more?
Yes, sorry. Thank you for everyone joining here today, and also for those online. This is okay? All right, so I'll begin. Terror, terror, terror. Read a WhatsApp message that S, a community worker in Gaza, sent to a friend on 10th of October, 3 days after the beginning of Israel's attack on Gaza. A journalist and translator, conveyed this terror in more detail as it unfolded in a voice message to a friend on 15th of October, and I quote, "I am still in my home in Gaza. Many people fled to the south, but many stayed here in the north after they saw the massacre of 70 people and more than 200 injured on the road south. People got scared, including the people who had intended to flee, and decided to stay here. And then after that, there was so much bombing in the south, so much bombing and bombing and bombing, massacres, so many people martyred, so many people killed. That is to say, people left Gaza, went to the south, and sought shelter with people there, and then they all got shelled. You even have people who fled to the south and came back to Gaza." End of quote. This was not the only mass killing that occurred after Israel ordered on 12th and 13th of October more than 1 million people to leave the northern part of Gaza. On 21st of December, the New York Times confirmed the scale of killings when it reported that, quote, "During the first 6 weeks of the war in Gaza, Israel routinely used one of its biggest and most destructive bombs in areas it designated safe for civilians." Palestinians also faced the dreadful prospect of moving south under the, quote, "total siege condition" that Israel's defense minister Yoav Gallant had proclaimed on 9th of October, with water, food, fuel, and medical supplies quickly running out within days. In a voice message from 15th of October, A reported that, quote, "There's no water at all. It's a huge problem. It's catastrophic." When Israel's, end of quote. When Israel's evacuation order was announced 3 days earlier, A understood its destructive implications and asked in another voice message, quote, "Where is the West? Where are these human rights they preach? Where is international law? This is genocide," he continued, "and it should be immediately stopped." A used the word genocide to denote the unprecedented destruction unfolding around him, what he and others were describing already in those first days, right, mid-October, of Israel's attack as, quote, "indescribable, beyond reality, and a catastrophic stage." Israel's assault also fits the definition of genocide in the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide from December 1948. Now, contrary to much popular perception, genocide is not killing of a large number of people in a short period of time. Rather, the convention requires, in Article 2, quote, "an intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such in one or more of 5 ways." Killing members of a group is one of them, but Israel's assault very much fits another, deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Israel's leaders, members of the war cabinet, and senior army officers, so people with what's called in international law command authority, expressed genocidal intent in clear, direct, and explicit ways immediately following 7th of October, As documented in many places, we also heard those of you who are following the ICJ, the South Africa case today. It was also expressed in a statement that 60 senior scholars of the Holocaust, genocide, and mass violence, including myself, signed on 9th of December. The statement notes, for instance, Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog's depiction on 13th of October of all the Palestinians in Gaza as, quote, responsible for the Hamas-led attack on 7th of October. And he said, and I quote him, "It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. This rhetoric," he continued, "about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true." End of quote. The scholar's statement also notes the dehumanizing language against Palestinians, such as describing them as, quote, human animals in Gallant's total siege proclamations from 9th of October. Now, if it remained unclear whether Gallant was describing only Hamas militants in this way or Palestinians in Gaza more broadly, the Israeli coordinator of government activities in the territories, the occupied territories, Major General Hassan Aliyan, clarified it in the next day in a video message directed to the people of Gaza, and I quote him, "Hamas has turned into ISIS, and the residents of Gaza, instead of being appalled, are celebrating. Human animals must be treated as such." He's talking to the people of Gaza. "There will be no electricity and no water in Gaza. There will only be destruction. You wanted hell, you will get it." End of quote. Now, this is a key point. We are not talking here about sporadic statements or statements that were made only at the heat of the moment after 7th of October, but dozens of statements by people with command authority, which they made over time in using various mechanisms of dehumanizing Palestinians and depicting Palestinians in Gaza as a whole as enemies. Alongside human animals, for instance, Israeli leaders depicted Palestinians as Nazis. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, for instance, spoke on 7th of October alongside the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, describing Hamas as, quote, the new Nazis. And then on 5th of November, an unidentified senior Israeli official, most likely again Netanyahu, noted, quote, "After the war, it would not be enough to rebuild Gaza, but to conduct the process of denazification." End of quote. This is crude weaponization of Holocaust memory, which provides license, quote, "to remove all restraints so that Gaza will not return to what it was," to quote again Gallant's words on 9th of October. Because if we're fighting Nazis, everything is permitted. There is no law. There's also little doubt about the dehumanization of Palestinians in Israeli society well before 7th of October. Shirts printed by Israeli army units 15 years ago have depicted pregnant Palestinian women and children as military targets. In this particular shirt of the snipers unit, as you see, it says 1 shot, 2 killed. Very explicit and direct, right? So Palestinian women, pregnant women, children as military targets. Calls of death to the Arabs have characterized the annual settler flag marches through the old city of Jerusalem, and students as young as 13 in Israel sing anti-Palestinian and racist songs such as "Hoping That Your Village Burns Down." Indeed, the widespread, explicit, and unashamed incitement to genocide in Israeli politics and media immediately after 7th of October reflects a deeply racist society. Incitement to genocide is also a crime under the UN Genocide Convention, noted in Article 3. Now, just a few examples here of this issue of incitement, right? Burn Gaza now completely, no less. The ruling Likud party member of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, Nissim Vaturi, proclaimed on social media on 17th of November. "There are no innocent people in Gaza," Knesset member Avigdor Lieberman wrote on social media on 1st of December as the ceasefire ended. Journalist David Mizrahi, Welt Times, suggested on social media already on 7th of October, quote, "to turn the Gaza Strip into a slaughterhouse and violate all norms on the way to victory," adding, "we are facing human animals." This is before Gallant, right? 4 days later, another Israeli journalist, Roy Sharon, commented on social media, quote, if in order to finally eliminate the military capabilities of Hamas, we need 1 million bodies, then let there be 1 million bodies. Explicit, direct, unashamed. This is another example, by the way, the latter quote, of how the slippage between targeting Hamas and targeting Palestinians is expressed. Annihilatory language has also appeared in public spaces in Israel, such as banners on bridges in Tel Aviv that call to annihilate Gaza here, and the image of victory is 0 people in Gaza. That Israeli leaders intended for the forced displacement of over 1 million Palestinians from the north to the south of Gaza to result in large-scale physical destruction of Palestinians is also clear from the admission of Israeli army spokesperson Daniela Gali on 10th of October that, quote, thousands of tons of munitions had already been dropped on the Gaza Strip, as he said, and, quote, we are now focused on what causes maximum damage, end of quote. This then was indeed deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, in the language of the UN Genocide Convention. And physical destruction followed. Israel has dropped so far more than 65,000 tons of explosives on Gaza. That's the equivalent of 3 atomic bombs of the kind that the US dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. 3, killing almost 23,000 Palestinians, with thousands more buried under the rubble and dead. Around 12,000 of those killed so far were children and youth. Israel's attack has injured nearly 60,000 Palestinians, inflicting on them severely body and mental harm, the second act of genocide listed in the convention. Israel's attack has moreover forcibly displaced over 1.9 million Palestinians, which is 90% of the population in Gaza, creating conditions of thirst, catastrophic hunger, and severe overcrowding with outbreak of infectious diseases. We already know that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are actually sick with infectious diseases, and this is now a situation that risks escalating quickly and may actually result, as experts around the world are telling us, with 500,000 Palestinians in Gaza dying in the next year from starvation and infectious disease. The systematic targeting of hospitals in Gaza by the Israeli army, which has failed to provide any evidence for significant military activity in them, as a recent investigation by the Washington Post has shown, has further intensified the conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction. As in other cases of genocide, here too, Israel has destroyed religious, cultural, and educational institutes in Gaza in a systematic way, including hundreds of schools, universities, libraries, mosques, churches, and cemeteries. The lack of any substantial response from the International Criminal Court so far, the ICC, and the complete silence of the Office of the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, absolute silence from that office, in the face of this unfolding genocidal assault, renders A's question, remember from 12th of October, where is international law, particularly urgent. Now, the current application of South Africa to the International Court of Justice, the World Court, which is different than the ICC, to initiate proceedings against Israel for the crime of genocide, may be the first time we see a crack in Israel's impunity, and we're seeing it in the international legal system, especially if the ICJ accepts the request in the application for urgent provisional measures, which are under discussions these days, especially in order of the court for Israel to cease its military operations against and inside Gaza. Still, A's question reminds us of Israel's decades-long impunity in the international legal system and its destructive consequences for Palestinians. Answering A's question requires a brief account of the way international law reemerged after World War II, with Nazism and what we now call the Holocaust as a central context, and with the UN Genocide Convention, its key innovation, completely new crime under international law. Now, many words have been written about the origins of the convention, the 2 years of negotiations that preceded it, its shortcomings, and the meanings of words such as in part, right, in whole or in part. One thing is clear, however, The new crime of genocide rendered the Holocaust exceptional. This served a purpose. It separated the Holocaust completely from the piles of bodies and destroyed cultures that European imperialism and colonialism, which was still very much ongoing at the time, right, the late 1940s, had left around the world in the preceding few centuries. Now, this too has received significant scholarly attention. Yet this not only secured white supremacy by relativizing its destructive past and present, right, colonial genocide, it also reflected the ambiguous foundational role of Jews in the Judeo-Christian Western world. Now, the Jewish question had indeed stood at the heart of the Nazi worldview. As historian Alon Confino has argued, the Nazis saw Jews as foundational to the Judeo-Christian world that they sought to destroy and to create on its ruins a Nazi civilization. So reestablishing Jews as foundational to the West in a positive way made sense in the emergence of an international legal order in response to Nazism. But ambiguity persisted. And on the ground, removed from this ideational realm, Jews very much actually remained a question and a problem in the eyes of many. The Jewish state that was proclaimed in May 1948, several months before the adoption of the UN Genocide Convention, resolved this tension. Jews now had a state, modeled on the European nation state and defined in ethno-national and ethno-religious terms as a Jewish state. The exceptional status of the Holocaust and of Jews in the West rendered the new Jewish state, by implications, also exceptional, especially in view of the many Holocaust survivors who chose to rebuild their lives there. So the Holocaust, Jews, Israel, exceptional status was immediately significant in blurring the Nakba, the foundational crime of the Israeli state, the mass expulsion of more than 750,000 Palestinians, the massacre and killing of 50,000 Palestinians, and the destruction of hundreds of Palestinian villages and towns in the 1948 war. Indeed, the idea that Israel could commit any crime under international law became, in this exceptional framework, unimaginable, unspeakable. Impunity for Israel, therefore, was baked into the international legal system from the moment it reemerged after World War II, immediately from the beginning. The urgent need to blur the Nakba also stemmed from the broader impetus to deny the nature of the Israeli state as a settler colonial project, which paradoxically, of course, reproduced the racism and white supremacy that had targeted Jews for exclusion and ultimately for destruction. It was a very paradoxical situation, of course. Israeli President Herzog nevertheless expressed this white supremacy quite explicitly in an interview on MSNBC on 5th of December, and I quote him, "This war is a war that is not only between Israel and Hamas," he said in response to a question about the high level of killing of Palestinians in Israel's attack on Gaza. Now, this is already significant, right? Because it's an admission that the attack is not only against Hamas. He says it directly. It's a war, he continued, that is intended really, truly to save Western civilization. We are attacked by a jihadist network, an empire of evil, and this empire wants to conquer the entire Middle East. And if it weren't for us, Europe would be next, and the United States follows. End of quote. Herzog builds here on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's infamous association in late October and early November of Israel's attack on Gaza with the biblical story of Amalek. Now, this is a story, the Amalek story, of the Israelites destroying completely a people perceived as a whole, as an enemy, as the ultimate evil, right? There's no multiple interpretations to the story, the biblical story of Amalek. And even if it applies only to Hamas, it's still genocidal because it's a story about a total destruction of a society and a culture that's perceived as the ultimate enemies of the Israelites, the Jews, right? But Herzog places it on a modern scale as the last stand against global apocalypse and the demise of, quote, Western civilization. Herzog thus expressed a colonial rationalization of destruction of people under colonial occupation, but here taken to extremes, couched within a discourse of religious war that points to the Jewish supremacy at the heart of white supremacy, in this case of settler colonialism. Now, Israeli leaders with command authority have used such religious discourse from the very beginning of their assault on Gaza, including numerous references to a struggle against evil, which Herzog also did, Gaza as, quote, a city of evil, as Netanyahu described it already on 7th of October, and a war of the people of light against, quote, the people of darkness, as Netanyahu explained on 25th of October, and there's many others examples. Now, this discourse hardly remained confined to the leadership level, however, and officers and soldiers in the Israeli army have been mirroring it constantly on the ground in Gaza. Here, by the way, you see Israeli President Herzog scribbling on a missile meant to be used in Gaza, right? Writing a message on the missile, which is actually, we rely on you, on the missile. So officers and soldiers have been using this discourse and mirroring it constantly on the ground. A video created by Israeli soldiers in the Sajaiya neighborhood in Gaza on Friday, 8th of December, shows them setting fire to a truck with food and water in it. Some of you may have seen this video. It's circulated quite widely on social media. How they describe what they are doing is horribly revealing, and I quote from the video. It is the second candle of Hanukkah, the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. We are in a factory of candy that is given to children who carry out terrorist attacks. We are bringing the light to this dark place, burning it until there remains no remnant of it. End of quote. Now, if, as Herzog said on 13th of October, right, that all Palestinians in Gaza are responsible for the Hamas-led attack on 7th of October, it follows that Palestinian children receive candy not because they're children, right, but because they are terrorists. It is also not at all by coincidence that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said in a message to Israelis 3 days earlier on 5th of December that, quote, this week we will light the first candle of Hanukkah. Our soldiers will bring light to the darkness, in the alleyways of Gaza, in the ruins of Sajaiya, in the terrorist lairs in Khan Yunis. The light together as a great light will cleave the darkness. End of quote. So the soldiers are mirroring the language almost word to word in Sajaiya. Another video, also taken on 8th of December, captures other soldiers, also referring to Netanyahu and Herzog, by singing that they are in Gaza, quote, to occupy, to follow the commandment to root out the seed of Amalek, and that our well-known slogan is no innocent civilians. Again, some of you might have seen this video, which circulated very widely on social media. And on 21st of December, to take one final example, a platoon commander in a reserve battalion spoke in a public event in honor of the battalion and its role in Gaza so far. The reserve officer summarized the biblical story, another biblical story. There's a lot of biblical stories, by the way, in this attack. In Genesis 34, with Shimon and Levi, sons of Jacob, who conduct a revenge attack on the people of Nablus in response to the rape of their sister. The soldier, the officer, then explained that what Shimon and Levi did in Nablus, in the biblical story, his unit did in Bet Hanun in Gaza. Quote, but the mission is not yet complete, he said. We still have the whole of Gaza to do what we did in Bet Hanun. End of quote. These and other many such explicit elaborations of the rationale of Israel's genocidal attack on Gaza explain its unprecedented levels of destruction and mass killing, which a number of experts are telling us of only a few cases of such intense mass violence in the last 100 years. Some of them are saying that this is the most intense case of mass violence since World War II, in terms of the scale of killing and destruction in such a short period of time. Looking back at the long 20th century, which is arguably ongoing, We see, furthermore, that colonial wars against indigenous people, especially in response to uprisings against colonial rule, have resulted in genocide, as happened, for instance, after the Herero rebelled in 1904 against German colonial rule in Southwest Africa. General Lotto von Trotha, the German military commander there, issued an extermination order, right, in response, justified by the rationale of, quote, a race war. By 1908, the German authorities had murdered 10,000 Nama and had achieved their stated goal of destroying the Herero, killing 65,000 of them, around 80% of the population. We can also think about the Ottoman authorities during World War I, who viewed the entire population of Ottoman Armenians as collaborators with the Russian enemy. Ottoman authorities therefore decided, in the context of fierce fighting in the Caucasus in spring of 1915, to deport all the Armenians from the Anatolian heartland of the empire, which was their homeland for thousands of years, away from the front lines towards the desert area in today's Syria and Iraq. Deporting millions of civilians to a desert was itself a measure aimed at bringing about their destruction, but the mass deportations quickly turned into death marches, with Ottoman units and guards, in some cases together with Kurdish perpetrators, massacring Armenians on the way. Altogether, Ottoman state authorities murdered 1.5 million Armenians in this case of genocide. We can also remember that the Hutu-controlled Rwanda state saw all Tutsis in Rwanda and their Hutu supporters as accomplices of the Rwanda Patriotic Front, the Tutsi-led rebel army that invaded Rwanda from Uganda in 1990, initiating a war that culminated in the Rwanda genocide in 1994. The case of the Rwanda genocide is especially relevant today because as it was happening, US President at the time, Bill Clinton, and his administration preferred not to recognize the unfolding mass violence for what it clearly was to everyone watching, genocide. Wary of intervening in Africa following the loss of US soldiers in Somalia the previous year, the US government denied that genocide was happening in Rwanda, as that would have required, according to the UN Genocide Convention, intervention to stop it. It is now beyond urgent to intervene to stop Israel's genocidal attack on Gaza, which is the reason that it is crucial that the ICJ accept the request for provisional measures in South Africa's application and order Israel to stop its military operation against and inside Gaza. This is urgent also because all Palestinians under Israeli occupation and control are now in grave danger. In Gaza, of course, but also the 3.5 million Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, and the 1.8 million Palestinian citizens of Israel. In the West Bank, the Israeli army, hand in hand with settlers, have intensified their violence against Palestinians after 7th of October, killing over 330 Palestinians, wounding thousands, arresting thousands, and forcibly displacing at least 16 whole Palestinian communities. A continuation of a vicious ethnic cleansing campaign that Israel has been carrying out in the occupied West Bank for years, with particular intensity in 2023 before 7th of October. By summer 2023, almost no Palestinians remained in the vast area stretching east from Ramallah to the outskirts of Jericho before 7th of October. Palestinian citizens of Israel are also facing a state assault against them, with hundreds of arrests since 7th of October for any expression of identification with Palestinians in Gaza facing genocidal violence. Intimidation and silencing of Palestinian students and faculty and staff in Israeli universities is widespread, and the Israeli police commissioner, Kobi Sheftai, threatening to expel to Gaza Israeli Palestinians identifying with Palestinians there. Now, it's not a criminal offense, by the way, in Israel to identify with Palestinians in Gaza. Right? These alarming developments and measures build on a view of Palestinian citizens of Israel as potential enemies that stretches back to the military rule imposed on the 156,000 Palestinians who had survived the Nakba and remained within the territory that became Israel in 1948. This military rule, right, that was imposed immediately in 1948 in what was seen by the entire world as a democracy, but tens of thousands of people were held under military rule, lasted until 1966. The exclusion and violence against Israeli Palestinians reached new levels in the last 5 years. In 2018, Israel passed the Jewish nation state basic law. Now, Israel doesn't have a constitution, so basic laws replace its constitution. This law relegates Israeli citizens who are not Jews, and particularly the 20% of them who are Palestinians, to second-class status in the Article 1 of this law. Then, in May 2021, as many Israeli Palestinians came out to protest another Israeli assault on Gaza, together with an assault on the Palestinian neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, the Israeli police responded with massive repression and violence, arresting hundreds. The situation deteriorated quickly as Jewish and Palestinian citizens clashed across Israel, in some places, as in Haifa, with Jewish citizens attacking Palestinian citizens on the streets and breaking into houses of Palestinians, even breaking into their houses and attacking them in their houses in Haifa. The following year, in 2022, Israel enacted another law, the citizenship law, which denies Palestinians married to Israeli citizens permanent residency in Israel, and thus bans Palestinians from Israeli occupied territories from living in Israel with their Palestinian partners. Ayelet Shaked, then Israel's interior minister, applauded the passing of the law as, quote, an important result for the security of the state and its fortification as a Jewish state, expressing an apartheid and Jewish supremacist rationale that cast Palestinians collectively as a security threat. Now, Palestinian citizens of Israel have retreated to their communities and homes. Their fears are well-founded. The Israeli public sphere, politics, and media, as I mentioned, are dripping with eliminationist anti-Palestinian racism. It is in this situation that Itamar Ben-Gvir, the far-right and settler who serves as Israel Minister of National Security, has overseen the distribution of thousands of weapons to Israeli civilians who have formed hundreds of, quote, new self-defense units after 7th of October in Israel. Palestinian citizens of Israel are therefore now in a situation that is dangerously similar to the one that Armenians in the Ottoman Empire faced, and also to the ones that Tutsis in Rwanda after 1990 faced. They're seen by state authorities and by very many in society as particularly dangerous enemies within. Ending Israel's impunity is therefore urgent. It is urgent for Palestinians in Gaza, for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, and for Palestinians in Israel. It is urgent in addition because if now, with Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, unprecedented in its explicitly declared intent, unprecedented in the open and vicious discourse of incitement to genocide, and unprecedented in the levels of killing and destruction in such a short time, if now the international legal system will continue to stick with the Jewish supremacy that provides the basis for Israel's impunity, then, as Palestinian legal scholar Noa Erekat put it in this moment speech on 1st of November, and I quote her, everywhere, anywhere in the globe is not safe. That is for the very many marginalized and persecuted groups, for people facing state violence and genocide, for the over 100 million forcibly displaced people around the world, they're already very precarious conditions, the acute danger and insecurity that they experience every day, this will deteriorate further. Or Israel's unprecedented genocidal assault, rooted in an unprecedented impunity in the international legal system in the face of 75 years of well-documented crimes of Israeli settler colonialism, and unprecedented settler colonialism rooted in Jewish supremacy. All this may now create the conditions, perhaps, for unprecedented change. That's the alternative. All eyes, therefore, are now on the ICJ, which ordered in March 2022 provisional measures to stop military operation in the case of Russians' genocidal attack on Ukraine, with less evidence and a less catastrophic condition on the ground now in Gaza. Now, I'm not belittling Russia's genocidal assault on Ukraine at all. I'm just saying that now we have more evidence for genocide and a far more catastrophic situation on the ground. 2 years before that, in 2020, the ICJ ordered provisional measures to stop military operations in the case of Myanmar's genocidal attack on the Rohingya, which is similar in many ways to Israel's genocidal attack on Gaza. Indeed, the UK, Germany, Denmark, France, and the Netherlands and Canada submitted a few weeks ago a joint declaration of intervention in support of the case against Myanmar that is full of arguments about genocide that are very relevant also to the case against Israel. There is no time now to discuss these documents, but they do signal the potential of a new chapter of the international legal system, challenging its white supremacist basis, and specifically in the case of Israel, the Jewish supremacist basis, in an unprecedented way. This is a watershed moment. To be sure, how such a change might happen is far, far from clear. But if the history of genocide in the last century points, as I suggest, to the genocidal nature of Israel's assault on Gaza for more than 3 months now, it also tells us that genocidal violence creates military, political, and economic dynamics that at times also devour the genocidal state and society itself. Nazi Germany, Rwanda, and Serbia come to mind as well-known examples. Powerful state leaders then also found themselves in front of international courts, which seemed unimaginable just a few years prior. Think about Slobodan Milosevic. And not only leaders, some journalists, from Julius Streicher in Nazi Germany to Ferdinand Nahimana in Rwanda, who incited genocide and normalized the dehumanization of the people targeted by the state in newspapers and in radio. There's dozens of such journalists in Israel today, also face their day of truth and justice in international courts sometimes. And while genocide leaves destruction, loss, trauma, and pain for years, for generations, Reverend Dr. Munter Itzhak reminded the many who listened to his Christ in the Rubble sermon at the Evangelical Lutheran Christmas Church in Bethlehem on 23rd of December that, and I quote the Reverend, "We will be okay. We will rise and stand up against from the midst of destruction, as we have always done as Palestinians, although this is by far the biggest blow we have received in a long time." End of quote. Israelis may then also rise from the destruction they have caused. It will require truthful reckoning with Israeli mass violence against Palestinians since the 1948 Nakba. It will require understanding that Jewish supremacy undermines rather than enhances their security. That racism and settler colonialism has put them and continues to put them in danger. That their long-term security depends on the long-term security of Palestinians, and that this security requires equality, freedom, and dignity for all the people, Palestinians, Jews, and others who live and will continue to live between the river and the sea. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Raz. I'm going to turn the floor over now to Shannon, who's our discussant, and she has the floor for the next 10 minutes.
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back? Great, thanks. So I want to start by thanking Raz for this talk and for his thoughtful analysis of the current situation in Gaza, as well as the relevant historical, legal, and moral features of the crisis. But I also want to be sure to thank him for his willingness to speak about this issue with such moral clarity. Raz published a piece called "A Textbook Case of Genocide" on October 13th. Now, while I don't, this was less than a week after Hamas attacked civilians in Israel and Israel began its military response. Now, while I don't necessarily agree that this is a textbook case of genocide, and this was well before we had a lot of the evidence that we have available to us now, I think Roz did something really powerful by drawing our attention to the features of genocide and the features of Israel's response to the October 7th attacks so early. It gives us a moral, legal, and historical yardstick that allows us to see how much worse things are now, but also how clear some aspects of the crisis were from the start. So just to thank him for that contribution, as with this one today. Another really important aspect of what Roz has said today is to talk about the experience of Palestinians in Gaza, not just the numbers of lives lost or people missing or children who are now orphans, but the lived experience of every single person who has been living in Gaza since October 7th. Not just the danger, not just the lack of food and water, but the sheer terror. The experience of the victims of Israel's offensive is not particularly relevant for establishing an international crime. Crimes are about the wrongdoing of the perpetrator, not the suffering of the victims. So as part of the rest of the world, watching these crimes unfold, caring about those experiences is important. Now to the crimes. Roz is right that the dehumanizing language used by parts of Israeli society for many years, and the genocidal language used by Israeli government leaders since October 7th could not be more obvious. There has indeed been, quote, widespread, explicit, and unashamed incitement to genocide, end quote. There have also been war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated against the Palestinian people since October 7th, as Roz illustrates, and for years prior to October 7th. And this is actually something that one of the lawyers spoke about at the ICJ this morning, that kind of Israel's defense that they're going to present tomorrow morning, very early. The kind of way that they will be taken seriously as saying that they're not committing genocide is really weakened by the fact that they think that there's not war crimes or crimes against humanity also happening. So their kind of defense of whatever has been happening in this offensive is going to make the defense against genocide particularly weak. And there's a lot of evidence of genocide. The strongest evidence of genocide, in my opinion, is through the predicate crime of deliberately inflicting on the Gazans conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. This siege has resulted in conditions for nearly everyone in Gaza that are not or will not be conducive to life. The fact that the siege impacts everyone inside the borders, other than Hamas fighters who may be hoarding supplies, ironically, the very people Israel claims to be withholding those supplies from with the siege, is what makes this such strong evidence of the intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza. Ross has outlined some other features of the air and ground invasion that have resulted in mass casualties. And yet, this may not be enough. Under international criminal law, we need to be able to establish not only that there is genocidal intent, and that there are predicate crimes like killing, causing serious bodily or mental harm, or deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about a group's destruction. But there has to be a tight connection between the intent and the act, and the connection may or may not be close enough here according to the law. Again, the intent on the part of some government leaders is clear, and for other leaders, it's clear that genocide might be a desirable result, but not necessarily that they are intending for it to happen through their own actions. It is also clear that horrific violence is being perpetrated on Gazans. It may not be enough to prove in the International Criminal Court that the Israeli government designed its military campaign to wipe out the Palestinian people. And that's kind of a separate question from the political question as to whether or not the chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, would be willing to bring such a charge. One response that Israel might give, shockingly, is that it could be worse. Despite the unprecedented scale of Israel's assault, their military has access to enough weaponry to actually wipe out the Palestinian population more completely than they have thus far. What a horrible defense. But they could make it and claim that it shows they don't intend to destroy a group in whole or in part, at least with their bombing campaign, because they would have done so. I don't want to spend any time defending the actions of the Israeli government. But what I do want to do is encourage us to think about what is powerful about the term genocide and why it might feel important to use it. If it is to invoke the Genocide Convention and use the moderate power of the International Court of Justice to force Israel to cease military operations in Gaza, or to shame the United States into reevaluating its unequivocal support of Israel, this is a powerful reason to try to establish that the term is rightly applied. But if it is so that we can ensure that Netanyahu is charged and convicted of genocide, we are going to be disappointed. It is quite unlikely that that will happen. And if it is to establish the severity of what is happening in Gaza and the hatred that is allowing it to happen, then I would encourage us to think beyond the power of the word genocide. The harm, the suffering, the wrongdoing is not made worse because we can successfully apply a particular criminal statute. Lemkin and his contemporaries imagined genocide as the crime of crimes. Many folks today care about genocide because of the Holocaust or another genocide, or because they see international criminal law as a hierarchy and genocide is at the top. But what is happening in Gaza, what is happening anywhere, is not less criminal, less horrific, less grounded in hatred of a group of people for being who they are or being on the land they live on, if the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court doesn't think a genocide is happening. Our moral imagination and our moral responsibility are much greater than a single word. What it means for us to say things like never again requires that we reckon, as Raz argues, with much more. Thank you.
Thank you. So Raz, because you are our guest speaker today, when I chair these types of events, I always give the guest speaker the option, if you want to exercise it, to respond to the comments that in this case Shannon has made. If not, we'll just go to questions.
Just to say thank you so much, Shannon,
Yeah.
for reading and engaging. But I think let's
So let's go
open
to
it up
okay.
and-
Okay, so let's open the floor to questions and answers. We have people that are, I believe, still listening online, if I'm not mistaken, or viewing this online. And so there's a Q&A box that you can sort of pose your question. I'll get to the online questions in a moment. But as I said, in terms of the introduction, I want to give first opportunity to people who are dissenters, who might have a dissenting point of view, a strong objection to the narrative that was presented and the argument that was presented by Raz Segal. Let's take those questions first in the name of informed debate. And then if no one raises their hand, then we'll go to just a general, broad, open taking of questions on the topic, the presentation, things that were said or not said that bear on this topic. So the floor is open to dissenters first and foremost. Yeah, at the back. Go ahead.
This may not totally be a dissenter opinion, but I was curious what response you would pose instead of Israel's current one shooting the October 7th.
Yeah, so let's go one question at a time, and then we'll collect them at the end. So, the question is, what should have Israel done? How should have Israel responded normatively to October 7th?
Not the person to suggest how any state should respond. Should I speak from here or else?
I mean,
Yeah.
can people in the back hear me sitting
Can you
down?
all hear me? And
Yeah,
okay.
just project your voice a little bit so they can
Okay.
hear.
I'm not the person to say how any state should respond to an attack against it. Okay, but I can say a number of things in response to this sort of question. First of all, genocide is an illegal response in any case. Okay, genocide is not a lawful response. That's one thing. Does a state have a right to repel an attack against it on its territory? Absolutely. Does it have a right then to perpetrate genocide? Absolutely not. Right. So that's one thing that I'll say. But if we ask about response, if indeed we consider 7th of October as a watershed, right? And I really think that there's no going back to before 7th of October. This is an unprecedented moment. Things will change. Because it's an unprecedented moment, it's very difficult to think how things will change, to predict how things will change. The ICJ case, right, against Israel now is unprecedented. Who would have imagined, right, in the culture of impunity to Israel for decades, that Israel would stand trial in the World Court for Genocide, right? This is a watershed moment. So in the spirit of a watershed moment, I'll just say that in terms of response, maybe it's time for Israel and for Israelis, as I suggested at the end of my talk, right, to consider, for example, if military occupation, racism, settler colonialism, siege. Gaza was under the longest siege in modern history before the 7th of October, 16 years, right? Israelis could calculate how much calories people in Gaza would eat before 7th of October. Maybe a response would be for Israelis to consider if this has worked. Has this brought them security? No. Maybe a response should be to consider that maybe as I said, maybe their security depends not on oppression, but actually depends on the security of everyone in that land, right? But that's the little that I can say in response.
Yeah, next question, go ahead.
So obviously you've talked about Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza. What would you call Hamas's charter that aims to kill all Jews? Would you call that genocide, or what would you call it if you don't call it that?
The Hamas's charter, it keeps coming up in the debate.
Yeah.
It's clearly, anti-Semitic, incendiary, genocidal in the view of the questioner and many people who've read the document.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that aspect of this
I think
topic?
that I'm not at all going to defend Hamas. I think that from the very beginning, and also in the Jewish Current piece on the 13th of October, I've written and I've spoken very strongly against the Hamas attack. I've described it for what I think it was: an attack of a mass murder, a war crime, crimes against humanity, which are ongoing in the sense of hostage taking, right? I think that actually very few people who present the position that I present have spoken so forcibly against the Hamas attack on 7th of October. I think that Hamas has more than just this charter, as we know, and some of the other things that Hamas has published have a very different meaning to them. But the Hamas charter that you ask about is definitely annihilatory. I think that it's not enough, right, to bring just the Hamas charter to think about genocidal intent in the case of Hamas, right? It's absolutely a destructive document, if that's what you're asking about. Does it show us genocidal intentions on the part of Hamas? We need much more than that in that case. Also, I have to say, in international law, this is not in the convention explicitly, and Shannon can correct me if I'm wrong, but in international law, genocide also requires capacity, right? And it's clear in this case that Hamas does not have capacity to carry out genocide against Israel and Israelis. It has capacity, as it did, right, to carry out a horrific mass murder attack, without a doubt, right? It doesn't have capacity to carry out genocide.
Okay, so in the name of informed debate, let's maybe take one more dissenting question from the audience, and then we'll maybe take one dissenting question from online. Do you want to have a follow-up on that?
So I guess what you said, there would need to be more. So what else other than them saying that they want to annihilate all Jews would, like, it would mean that they would need to actually have the power to do that, and that would be.
Well, you need what more? You would need repeated systematic statements of intent, like we see in the case of Israel, over time by dozens of people with command authority, using various mechanisms of dehumanizing their target, using various mechanisms of portraying the people as a whole as legitimate military targets. You would need that kind of evidence, as we have in the case of Israel.
Yeah. Okay. You've asked the question already, so in the name of sort of fair play, can I? What's that? Yeah, I know, but your turn has passed. So maybe if we go through everyone, we can come back to you again. Let me just turn to Andrew. Andrew, if you're listening online, if there's a dissenting question, could you just read it out loud and we'll get Raz to answer? And I also want to mention Shannon, please feel free to jump in anytime you feel it's appropriate. So we'll take one online question, preferably a dissenting one, Andrew, if you can find one.
Please speak about Israel's, quote, right to defend itself further, since Gaza isn't another nation state.
Yeah, it's a re-articulation of the earlier question. How should have Israel responded to October the 7th, given that it's not a nation state, it's a quasi state, let's say. What more do you want to add, Maraz?
Again, I'll say briefly, and again, Shannon, if you, as far as I understand, the right to self-defense, there is definitely a right to self-defense in international law. The right to self-defense does not apply in occupied territory. Now, since Gaza, even after Israel has pulled out its army from within Gaza and its settlement in 2005, but Israel has retained full control of Gaza, of its borders, of what goes in, what goes out, the sea, everything. Israel has, that's why it could control how much and what food Palestinians in Gaza eat for years of siege. So there is a widespread international consensus that Gaza remains occupied territory, right? So the formally recognized occupied territories are the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. Therefore, there is no right to self-defense in occupied territories. That does not apply in international law.
Okay. And did you have another question that you can read out since we're?
Shannon had something to add.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry,
I was
Shannon.
just gonna say that all of that is right. I think we've talked about the Genocide Convention and where that came from. We can also think about crimes against humanity, which are intended to protect individuals who are part of groups. We could also think about war crimes, which are intended to minimize suffering in wartime. And you can say, I mean, so I agree there is a right to self-defense. That doesn't mean there's a right to do anything as part of that self-defense. One other response you can have is that you can distinguish kind of the legal and moral questions, and you can say, yes, and people have said this, Israel has a right to self-defense and anything can justify that. So one thing you might put yourself in the position of saying, or one might put themselves in the position of saying is, yes, I'm okay with committing war crimes or genocide or crimes against humanity because I think defending the state of Israel is that important, is my moral prerogative, right? But that doesn't mean that I don't agree that that's morally correct. That also doesn't mean that you're not violating international law.
Andrew, question?
Are we asking dissenting or just any?
Just anyone. I trust your judgment.
Okay. So this question is from Grace. Grace said, should the court find in favor of South Africa, what options would exist for the international community to intervene for the purpose of the protection of Palestinian citizens? Are there historic examples of similar responses from the community?
Yeah, so let's say we get a provisional judgment or even a final judgment. What next for the international community? Shannon, do you want to take that first?
I think if the ICJ decides to impose provisional measures, I think that one of the most important features of that is it's going to put the US in a really, really tricky position. The US has just kind of poo-pooed this completely. And I think if the ICJ, again, the ICJ does not have, like a lot of international law enforcement provisions, it cannot force anyone to do anything. But I think it would be a very bad look for the United States and hopefully would be a reason to for the US to reconsider its position at the moment.
Okay. Questions from the audience? Yeah, right there. Joseph. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Joe.
Yes, Pastor Segal, you spoke of October 7th as a watershed event. And given what we have witnessed from October 7th and subsequently, how has that influenced how you teach Holocaust education? Not an easy question, I know, and maybe too large for the moment.
I'll respond briefly. It's a very important question. Look, like impunity in the international legal system, Israel has also enjoyed an exceptional status in Holocaust and genocide studies, right? That means that it was possible. The exceptional status worked in the way that it was possible for very many scholars in Holocaust and genocide studies. I would say the vast majority of scholars in Holocaust and genocide studies, right, to basically marginalize or ignore in various ways the well-documented violations of international law and Israeli mass violence for decades, right? So like impunity in that sense. Now, because Israel's attack on Gaza now is so unprecedented, because the statements of intent are so explicit and unashamed, because the incitement in Israeli society and politics and media is so horrific, right? Israel has crossed all kind of red lines, right? It has broken all the rules, right? So that's why I said that we already see a crack in the impunity in the international legal system. Whatever happens in the ICJ case, by the way, we already see this crack, right? In the field of Holocaust genocide studies, now there is, a deep crisis, okay? There are people, unfortunately, primarily scholars who deal with the Holocaust. And I say, I'm a Holocaust scholar. I'm a Holocaust of the Jewish world. I'm a Holocaust scholar, right? But it's primarily scholars who work on the Holocaust. In November, they published a statement. About 150 scholars signed it. A lot of them are quite obscure figures in the field, but there's also some very significant scholars. Sal Friedlander, Jeffrey Kopstein, others who signed that statement. It's a horrific statement. It's a statement that mentions no crime of Israel whatsoever. Not war crimes, not crimes against, nothing, right? There's only Hamas. All the suffering and death and destruction in Gaza is only Hamas, right? And the statement also partakes in this dehumanization of Palestinians in the sense that Palestinians appear only as human shields, quote unquote, right? This is a particularly horrible dehumanization, right? Because it contains the word human, right? Human shields, so that they reproduce that. These are scholars of the Holocaust, right? Witnessing, like all of us, this attack and not able to say, not genocide, but anything about it. So it's a full exceptional status for Israel, full impunity, and the dehumanization of Palestinians. On the other hand, on 9th of December, a group of, as I mentioned, a group of 60 Holocaust and genocide study scholars, including myself, and also very many very influential figures in the field, a lot of very influential scholars in the field, published a statement that we published in Contending Modernities, which is of course very different. We deal also with the 7th of October Hamas-led attack, and we deal with Israel's attack on Gaza. We deal with the possibility of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and we also list some specific demands at the end of the letter. So there is a deep crisis today in the field, right? There are people who say business as usual, we can go on, right? No problem whatsoever, and there's very many of them, right? But there's also quite a lot who say business as usual in Holocaust and genocide studies is not possible anymore, right? Now think about it, that it tells us something. Obviously, we live in a world with a lot of genocidal violence. I mentioned the Myanmar's attack on Rohingya, Russia's attack on Ukraine. We all witnessed the complete ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh not long ago, right? But now this is Israel, and it goes to the heart, right, of Holocaust and genocide studies, of the international legal system, as I explained briefly. So there's a deep crisis. Now, I can tell you from my own, I direct the MA program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University, and I teach also in the undergraduate minor program that we have in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Now, students absolutely recognize this crisis, right, and this problem. They're also thinking, I mean, we live in a world that the promise of never again, right, has not been fulfilled, right? We live in a world where the project of Holocaust memory, global Holocaust memory, since the 90s, right? The new world that was supposed to be to emerge with the fall of the Soviet Union, right? The end of history, so on and so forth. That didn't work out so well. And if we think about mass violence and genocide around the world, the project of Holocaust education, right? I mean, we have many states in the US where Holocaust education is mandated in the K-12 system. Hasn't worked out that way, right? Also, in terms of coming to terms with US settler colonialism, US genocide, right? Students recognize that Holocaust and genocide studies, Holocaust memory, Holocaust education have in many ways failed, right? This is an integral part of the deep crisis that the field is in, right? I'm thinking about this a lot. I've been thinking about this well before 7th of October in relation to Israel, Palestine, and other issues. And this is also a watershed moment in the field, and it's also very difficult to know what will happen. And obviously, it will be tied to the ICJ case and things that we'll see, in the real world.
Yeah, okay, we have a lot of questions here. So let's go 1, 2, 3, and then we'll work our way to the back of the room. Go ahead.
I have a tangential question. So prior to October 7th, obviously there were
A little louder. Yes,
prior,
people about.
prior to October 7th, there were other instances of acts of genocide, obviously Myanmar, Nagorno-Karabakh. Israel had a role in providing weapons to those respective governments. I was wondering if you could also mention, if are there any type of things that include like accessories, aiding and abetting? For example, I know a lot of commentary have been provided about the U.S.'s role in aiding and abetting Israel, but I was just curious about kind of Israel's behavior on genocide beyond the context of Gaza and how that kind of informed its actions within Gaza, knowing that maybe it could get away with maybe 1 or 2 things, or how it could kind of shape its narrative ahead of the oral argument tomorrow.
Okay, question on aiding and abetting. Just in the interest of time, since we're sort of heading to the end, we'll take 3 questions and then you can jot them down and then answer them. And Shannon, you can weigh in as well. So Fida.
Yeah, my question is very similar, but specifically about the US's role. Like what kind of liability or, what kind of legal action might be taken against the US?
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Third question.
You made an argument earlier that I found very compelling about the construction of the Genocide Convention as opposed to colonization, and how it kind of separated the 2 things that might actually be very similar. I was wondering if you think the intent there in genocide and colonialism is the same, shares similarity, or is different, or what you view the role of intent in those situations.
I can respond to the aiding and abetting, maybe you can talk about the lawsuit.
Yeah.
CCR? Yeah.
Or you can.
So certainly aiding and abetting is one of the modes of participation at the International Criminal Court. Just because of the limited resources of the court, they are probably not going to go after anybody for aiding and abetting. They're going after the kind of primary actors, just given the limited resources. One other challenge that I'll mention is that the ICC has jurisdiction because Palestine is a party to the ICC and Israel is not a party to the ICC. So there's a piece in the New York Times this morning about Hamas's plans for the hostages. And one challenge for prosecuting Hamas, who I think absolutely should be prosecuted at the ICC, is going to be whether or not Israel chooses to participate and help the ICC with that investigation, which they're not obligated to do because they're not a state party.
Yep.
Yeah. There is an ongoing, the Center for Constitutional Rights has filed a case against US President Biden and against Blinken and Austin as well in a federal court in California in the Genocide Convention. Once there is a clear risk of genocide or indication of an unfolding genocide, there's also a legal obligation to intervene. So the lawsuit is also about the failure to intervene to stop, but also about of course, the US is the most significant ally of Israel, so the supply of weapons, so complicity in genocide. We'll see where this case goes. I think that what happens in the ICJ might also have some kind of an impact on the CCR case. So this is very significant in that case. Intent, so you're asking about whether we can talk about intent in a colonial mass violence, colonial genocide in the same way than, say, in the Holocaust or in the case of Gaza. Is that what you were?
How do you find them different or similar? Like, do you think they should be separate crimes? Do you think they're one and the same in terms of intent?
I think that when we very briefly.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's a very good question, but I was wondering, just related to that third question, if you could just talk about the relationship between the UN Genocide Convention and the legacy of colonialism, because it seems like these two themes were somewhat separate when the Genocide Convention was written, not really considering or viewing acts of things that were happening in the colonial world as being, genocidal acts. There was sort of like, there was the first world and then there was the developing world, and we can sort of separate these two. But I think part of the challenge is how do we connect them? So that's the challenge.
So I'll answer in this way. So as I said, the Genocide Convention, with the context of the Holocaust, that's the reason that the Holocaust was made unique, right? In this framework, that's the reason that we have. I mean, think about the name of the field, Holocaust and Genocide Studies. That's a very strange name, right? I mean, if we all recognize that the Holocaust was a genocide, what is this name, right? What is this name? It's a name that really embodies the hierarchy of Holocaust, genocide, everything else, right? And this is meant very much to separate, right, the crime of genocide from colonial genocide. Now, the thing is that until the 7th of October, as I said, also in the field of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and in the international legal system, this hierarchy, I think, worked very well for Israel, right? Because Israel is a settler colonial project. And that's why we're seeing this explicit intent on the part of Israelis. They imagine that they are fighting a colonial war against savages. So they can say whatever they want, they can do whatever they want. This is the mindset, right? So until the 7th of October, this worked very well. And we have very few cases of recognized genocide, right? Since World War II, right? Very few, because genocide indeed is very difficult to demonstrate the issue of intent, right? There's other things that are very difficult to demonstrate in genocide, as you said, genocide, but as you said, Shannon, but intent, I think, is very, very significant here. Now that we have a lot of clear indications, I agree that, you know, we won't see Netanyahu convicted for genocide. You know, it would be really highly, highly unlikely, right? But there are so many clear indications of the crime of genocide, such clear statements of intent, right? Dozens. By the way, Law for Palestine has collected 500 statements of intent and incitement on their website in a database. I urge all of you to take a look, Law for Palestine. Because of that, right, now the concept of genocide, right, if before the concept of genocide worked to uphold Israel's impunity, worked to uphold Israel's exceptional status in Holocaust and genocide studies, now the concept of genocide works in a completely different way, because Israel is perpetrating genocide in such a clear way, I argue, and others as well. And if you've heard the South African case presented today in the ICJ, it was very, very compelling and strong, right? Because of that, the concept of genocide now serves actually to challenge this whole framework, paradoxically, right? So we do actually see a significant, again, another indication of this watershed moment where the concept is not anymore works to uphold this hierarchy, but now it's actually an opportunity to think in a completely different way, basically, about modern mass violence, right?
We have about 10 minutes left. We'll go down the line, 1, 2, 3. So in that row there, starting at the window, go ahead.
Thank you so much for connecting this to colonialism and also the exceptionalization of the Holocaust. While the Hamas charter, I believe, does not structure the entire Palestinian armed resistance or the Palestinian people as a whole, the founding document structures that enacted colonial genocides do continue to structure our world today. So my question is, could you expand a little bit more on the current connections between the plight of the Palestinian people and those indigenous peoples continuing to experience systemic state violence across America and the rest of the world, as well as how the Holocaust and genocide discipline thinks about the right to armed struggle against an occupying power, especially with examples such as the Warsaw Uprising?
So there are 2 questions there. I'm reading it, so you can pick any one of those, Raz, to answer. You're the third question. There was someone just before you, yeah, and then we'll get to you. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to ask if you could elaborate a little bit on this construction of Israel as the last line of defense between the West and the East, especially given the history and continuing state of European anti-Semitism and the Israeli state's like cultural construction of itself as a Middle Eastern or Mediterranean country.
Okay, sir. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Dr. Segal, there was a tone of optimism in your presentation, suggesting that because these things are kind of breaking points, watershed moments and so on, the October 7th attack, the Israeli response, that the world might get together under international law to work on this problem. I think what we're talking about is the resolution of the conflict. And in that regard, how do you see the prospects for the UN, which was so instrumental in the creation of the State of Israel, being instrumental in resolving the conflict, perhaps through the 5 veto-wielding members of the Security Council?
Thank you. So 3 questions there, Raz, and Shannon, feel free to jump in on any of them.
Are they? Okay, I'll try to respond very briefly. I mean, there's much more to say. Obviously, this is also a watershed moment because it does demonstrate. I mean, there's so many indications of this in the decades prior of Israel's settler colonialism, right? Last evening, I mentioned that the post-1967 settler movement in the occupied West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, in Hebrew, the people who were sent to settle those territories, right, are called mitnachlim in Hebrew, which is literally settlers. You can use other words in Hebrew, but they're called in Israeli society and politics mitnachlim, right? There's so many indications of that, but now we see the language of colonial genocidal warfare so explicit and clear. So it is indeed also, and this is, I think, what worries a lot of people in the US, right? That if we finally come to terms with Israeli settler colonialism, which again, this watershed moment opens up this opportunity, then we finally also have to come to terms with settler colonialism in this place, right? And if there's, you know, if Canada, for example, has made some moves in coming to terms with settler colonialism there, but, you know, very, very, very partial moves, right? In the US, there's much, much less of that, right? So and this, of course, will require, you know, it require rethinking a lot of how we think about US history, US past and present, US society, how we teach these things, so many things, right? It will require a change about how we think about the US, how we think about Israel, right? Actually, how we think about the post-World War II world, right? So yes, there's an opportunity for that. If we think, I'm trying to respond to all the questions here in just a couple more minutes. I'm not sure that I'm optimistic, by the way, right? I do think it's a watershed moment. It's unprecedented. As I said, because it's unprecedented, it's not clear how things will unfold moving forward, right? But there will be change, I think. There is no business as usual, even though some people insist on imagining that there could be business as usual. I mean, Israel's right to self-defense is an articulation of this mindset of business as usual, basically, right? But I do think that if we talk about resolving the conflict, and I would highly recommend, by the way, that we move away from the language of conflict, actually, and we talk about what we're talking about, which is state violence. We talk in the language of state violence, not in the language of conflict, not even in the language of asymmetrical conflict, which would be much more accurate, right, in that sense. But if we talk about a future beyond state violence, right, beyond occupation, beyond siege, beyond settler colonialism, then this also connects to the question that I understood referred to. I said in my talk that Israel emerged as a nation state on the European model, right, defined in ethno-national and ethno-religious terms, and in but it also emerged as a settler colonial project, and in that sense, it reproduced paradoxically and horribly, right, the political structures, right, and the movements that actually targeted Jews for exclusion, that were at the core of anti-Semitism, right, and that ultimately targeted Jews for destruction, right? These were reproduced. I mean, the state, the European ethno-national, ethno-religious state, the exclusionary state, which is what Israel was founded on immediately as a Jewish state, right, reproduced this exclusionary mechanisms. So how could such a state be the solution, right, to the quote unquote Jewish question? By reproducing the very structures that targeted Jews? No, right? Yes, but no, right? By reproducing the settler colonialism that is at the root of colonial genocides, right? And we see it now, right? Very clearly, no. Again, yes, but clearly no, right? So if we think about moving beyond that, right? So moving beyond that, as I said in closing in my lecture, requires that we, and this is very important, that we finally do, you know, this is, I said this last night, it's very old school, right? It's about facing the truth, right? The documented truth about Israel's history, right? Enough with distortions, enough with weaponizing anti-Semitism for people who are talking about this truth, who are critiquing Israeli policies, right? Past and present. Facing the truth is important because that's the only way to bring Israel's security, right? Security for Israelis. Because as I said, the idea that Israel's security, right, is based on the oppression of Palestinians, eventually on the destruction of Palestinians, has not worked, right? It's also, by the way, not worked in many other colonial contexts, but it hasn't worked, right? So change, and here maybe I'm being a bit optimistic, but I actually don't think so. Change requires, right? I'm being optimistic in the sense that people can actually face the truth, right? A truthful reckoning, right? With it, this is a university, we're in a university. There are libraries of research about this truth. It's very diverse, by the way. There's a lot of things in that research. Not everyone in this room, by the way, will like everything in this research from various positions, by the way, right? But the idea that talking about this, teaching this, right, is either insinuated or directly, people are accused of being anti-Semitic, right? I was accused of being an anti-Semite a number of times, for example, right? This is beyond ridiculous. It's dangerous. It's dangerous to the solution of Israeli state violence. It's dangerous to the prospect of moving beyond Israeli state violence, right? So what do we need to do? We need a truthful reckoning with what has happened, with what's happening right in front of our eyes, with how Israel has reproduced the problems that were at the core of targeting Jews, right? How it has, it's not by accident, by the way, that the strongest allies of Israel today in Europe are anti-Semites. It's not an accident, right? That needs to end. All this absurdity that was in our face, right? And we could somehow hold it until the 7th of October in the system of impunity to Israel, in exceptionalism to Israel in Holocaust and genocide studies. This needs to end, right? You asked about arms deal, right? Duterte, when he was conducting a mass murder campaign in the Philippines, right? Came to the Philippines? Yeah. Yes. Came to yes. Came to visited Israel, right? For an arms deal, right? But state leaders visiting Israel have to go, according to the diplomatic protocol, where? To Yad Vashem, to Israel's main Holocaust remembrance site. So we had the case of a person who had just, by the way, if anyone here remembers, compared himself positively to Hitler. Yes, you remember that? People remember that? Compared, look it on, it's on YouTube, right? And then we had this absurd, crude, horrific spectacle of this person visiting Yad Vashem in Israel for an arms deal while conducting a mass murder campaign. This has to end, right? And now we have this opportunity, perhaps, to move beyond it.
We're gonna go for one more round, and I'm gonna try and get people on this side of the room. Negar? Anyone else? Last question to Negar.
Thank you. Another question, Professor Segal. I'm not sure if you have this conversation at, for example, a German university today. So I want to ask a more specific question about some of the weaponization of anti-Semitism, and specifically some slogans that has been, used against student groups that have been banned or defunded, protests that have been banned in the US, in Europe. If you can address specifically the slogan "From the river to the sea," and then also I think what led to the forced resignation of some university professors here, I think there was a chant of intifada on some university campuses, but specifically, more importantly, the river to the sea, both on the Palestinian side, but also we hear similar statements on the Israeli side.
Well, again, this very briefly. First of all, I urge all of you to read Palestinian historian Maha Nasser's pieces specifically on the slogan "From the river to the sea," on its history, on its meaning. Right? She's written a number of pieces also in the conversation. So look her up, Maha Nasser, a terrific Palestinian historian in Arizona. I think that it's clear that there's something very absurd in looking at calls for freedom and justice, right? Again, within this framework of weaponizing the discourse around anti-Semitism, weaponizing Holocaust memory, looking at calls for freedom and justice as somehow calls for the destruction of Jews in Israel. And that's why I ended my talk, as you saw, as I hope you heard, that the security and equality and dignity and freedom is something that everyone between the river and the sea, as I said, right, Jews, Palestinian, others, right, who live there and will continue to live there. So the calls for freedom and justice from the river to the sea are not calls to expel Jews, are not calls to destroy Jews. They're calls to stop a documented reality in front of our eyes. Occupation, siege, mass violence, right? That's what they are, right? They are calls that say, how is it that a state that argues that it's a democracy, right, holds under military occupation for decades millions of people, and how do we all accept it in this way? How do we accept this? Do democracies hold people for decades? Decades. There's an ongoing case also in the ICJ, by the way, about the legality of decades of Israeli military occupation. And it's also, by the way, would be very difficult to defend, right? Because how do you defend it, right? It's a decade of Israeli military occupation. So calls for freedom and justice and equality from the river to the sea are what they are. They're not calls for the destruction of Jews. And again, I urge you, this requires much more, obviously, and Maha Nasser does a very good job also at addressing the way that Jews might view this in a worrying way. She acknowledges this. She acknowledges this fully. So I urge you to take a look at this. But as you said, the former Israeli special envoy on anti-Semitism, Noa Tishby, right? I don't know if you've encountered her videos in the last, especially after 7th of October. She was here in the US. She played also a role in these kinds of attacks that forced university presidents at Harvard, at Penn to resign. She walks around and in her videos with a necklace and what's the word that I'm blanking with, but what hangs from the necklace? A pen, yes, a pen. That is the shape of the greater Israel, from the river to the sea, which, by the way, appears in a very important document of the Likud party in Israel, also, right? So she walks around she talks about how from the river to the sea is a genocidal assault against Jews, while walking around with a greater Israel, right, image on her. What is this greater Israel image? It's an image about Israeli settler colonialism, about Jewish supremacy, about the fact that only Jews deserve to live on that land, right? Again, we see this absurdity in front of our eyes over and over again, right? So yes, because a lot of people still consider Jews as unique, right? Which is, by the way, an anti-Semitic view. The fact that Jews are unique is an anti-Semitic view, right? So if you attack Palestinians fighting for freedom and for justice by adopting an idea that Jews are unique, you're engaging also in anti-Semitism in that, right? All this needs to end, right? It's absolutely legitimate to call for freedom and justice between the river and the sea. Absolutely legitimate.
I want to end today's session by echoing something that Shannon said when she began speaking, Raz. And she thanked you for sort of taking the risks to make these types of non-popular, controversial arguments, particularly at a moment like this. I know you've been receiving a lot of critical feedback, but you know, when you look through history, it's particularly people who swim upstream against the current that sort of opens the door for us reimagining a better future. So please join me, everyone, in thanking both Raz Segal and Shannon